Hello, welcome back to another video. My name's Gemma and it's time for April's episode of Hot or Not. And this month we are reviewing James by Percival Everett. So James has had actually a lot of positive praise today. I'm actually going to leave some reviews below for you because I know that Brian at Bookish, Ben at Ben Reads Good, and Katya at Turning Pages with Katya, I think her channel name is now. I will leave all three below. They've all done pretty glowing reviews of this. And I'm sorry to say, I am not going to buck that trend. This book was outstanding. And that comes from someone who did not particularly like Percival Everett's Booker-nominated book, The Trees, which I read a couple of years ago. I thought it was fine, but the juxtaposition between like serious topics and humour just grinded a little bit for me. It just didn't work for me. So I was a little bit unsure going into this one, but I do love me a retelling. And I actually hadn't read Huckleberry Finn before this month. So I read Huckleberry Finn by Mark Twain first. So James is a retelling of Huck Finn from the perspective of Jim, the slave, who goes on sort of an adventure with a young white boy, Huckleberry Finn. And so Everett has decided to take that story, switch the narrative voice to Jim, or James as he becomes later in the book, and really see it from a black perspective. So the first question is, do you need to read Huckleberry Finn in order to read James? No, absolutely not. I think James very much stands as a novel of its own accord, and I think it also deviates from Huckleberry Finn quite significantly at the end, but because Huck and Jim separate quite a lot throughout the book, you've got these touch points in it, but it's not following the narrative quite as strongly. And so I don't think you're really missing anything if you haven't read Huckleberry Finn, though I do think the sort of little Easter eggs of if you have read it and you know sort of some of these main points, it's quite nice to see those from a different perspective. So no, you don't have to have read Huckleberry Finn, but I think it did add a layer to it for me, having read that first. Obviously, one of the big criticisms of Huckleberry Finn as a book, as a children's book, is the level of racism within it. A lot of that is due to the time that it was written, in the late 1800s, I believe. And so it was the way things were then. That's not to say they were right, of course, they were not right, but that was the way things were, and that was reflected in Twain's writing. So what is really fantastic is that Everett's taken that, he's taken what is actually a very beloved book and looked at it through a completely different lens. And I think he's done that in a beautiful way. So one of the key things that Everett has focused on in this book is language, and the slave language and the way that slaves talk, which is really sort of stereotypically awful in Huckleberry Finn. And Everett, and this is early on in the book, so it's not a spoiler, he presents it as black slaves having two languages. They have a language that they speak to white people, the masters, which help to make white people feel safe because they think that black people are stupid and they don't understand things and they can't talk properly. And then they go away, and when they're together, a group of black people, they speak as if not more intelligently than white people. And you see him giving a class to some children, teaching them how to speak slave language, and just the comedic way that Everett presented it was fantastic, and I loved it. And language then continues to play like a key role throughout the book as he meets different characters, and we also look at themes and topics like passing within this, which was fantastic. The way that it was presented was really interesting, and I didn't see a lot of that coming. James in himself, James, as he later becomes, has one of the most fantastic character arcs that I've seen in quite a while. Even though he starts the beginning of the book as a strong person in his own right, we see him develop as his relationship with Huck develops, his friendship with Huck, and the people that he meets along the adventure. We see him change, we see him grow, we see him become stronger in himself, and it's so beautifully and subtly done. It's almost not until the very last line that you realise how far he's come, even though you've been there with him for the whole of this book. It's right at the end, the very last paragraph, and you think, yeah, okay, well done, Everett. That was a good character arc. Obviously, I'm talking about a lot of the positive parts of this book, and actually I struggled to find any negative parts of this book, but I would say that there is, of course, a lot of violence in this book. It's taking place in the antebellum South, and some of it was shocking. Isn't quite the right word, because we all know that this happens, we all know it, but I think seeing some of these things through James's eyes, made it more difficult to read and absorb. There's a fair whack of violence in this, and a few moments where I did find myself tearing up somewhat, because it's just, it gets you in the gut. The actual relationship between James and Huck is really great. You see that there's obviously this black-white dynamic, but it's altered by the fact that Huck is a child, and he doesn't have the prejudice that a lot of adults have, and even a lot of children have. Huck is a very innocent character, and he really does see James for who he is, and it's actually beautiful to watch their relationship grow through the book. So for those that don't know the sort of setup to Huckleberry Finn, we have Huckleberry has an abusive father, and he fakes his own death and runs away. At the same time, James is running away because he's caught wind of the fact that he's going to be sold and separated from his family. And they both end up together, and then they go on this adventure up the Mississippi. As you can imagine, Huck's retelling of it is very much about the adventure, whereas James's perspective is a lot more focused on trauma and loss. And I think the way that these two books speak to each other, the conversation that they have, is really, really interesting, because of course you're going to have a different perspective if it's from a child's perspective compared to an adult's, and a white person compared to a black person. And basically hats off to Everett. I think he pulled this off masterfully, and I would highly recommend this book. And so I gave it a big fat 5 stars, and as you can tell, I thought it was hot. If you've read this book, I'd love to know what you thought. If you haven't read this book, but I have convinced you, I would love to know. If you haven't read this book, but now you're not interested, I would also love to know that. As usual, I will be putting up a poll at the same time that this video goes live to choose which book I read for this series in May. So please bob over to my community tab and vote if you haven't already. And if you missed last month's episode of Hot or Not, I reviewed The Women by Kristen Hanna, and I will leave that here, and I will see you all very soon with another one. Bye guys.